this episode, we focus on the human and governance challenge that shows up right after you assign risk responses, getting the right people to act together in the real world. Risk response actions rarely belong to a single person or a single team because controls and systems span departments, and risk decisions often affect operations, budgets, and priorities. Collaboration is necessary because system owners have the technical knowledge, business owners understand mission and trade-offs, security teams bring risk expertise, and governance teams ensure obligations are met. At the same time, collaboration can quietly dissolve accountability if everyone shares the work but no one owns the outcome. Beginners sometimes think accountability means being strict or controlling, but in governance, accountability is simply clarity: who is responsible for what, by when, and how success will be verified. The goal is to collaborate in a way that increases buy-in and quality without creating a situation where risks linger because ownership is ambiguous. When you learn this balance, you move from writing good reports to driving real improvement. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at CGRC.Me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful place to begin is distinguishing collaboration from consensus, because these two ideas are often confused. Collaboration means working together to plan and execute actions, share context, and solve problems. Consensus means everyone agrees, which is nice when it happens, but not always possible, especially when risk responses require uncomfortable trade-offs. In risk response work, you often need collaboration even when full consensus is not achievable, because the organization still has to make a decision and move forward. This is where governance structures matter, because a governance process should define decision authority, escalation paths, and how disagreements are resolved. If everyone must agree before anything happens, risk response turns into gridlock. If one party dictates without listening, risk response turns into resentment and superficial compliance. Healthy collaboration listens, incorporates feedback, and then uses clear authority to finalize decisions. Accountability stays intact when decision authority and action ownership are explicit, even while many people contribute. Stakeholders are not just a list of names. They are roles with different incentives, and understanding those incentives helps you collaborate effectively. System owners often want stability, predictable workloads, and minimal disruption to production. Business owners often want speed, user experience, and cost control, while still meeting obligations. Security teams often want risk reduced and evidence strengthened, especially in high-impact areas. Compliance and governance teams often want traceability, consistent processes, and defensible documentation. Vendors may want to protect their reputation and limit liability, and they may have their own constraints. When you propose a mitigation, each stakeholder group may hear something different, such as extra work, delays, or new controls that change how people do their jobs. Collaboration means you acknowledge these perspectives and translate the risk response into terms that matter to each party, without changing the core requirement or hiding the risk. Accountability means you do not let incentives rewrite the risk statement, but you do let incentives shape how the response is implemented. One practical skill is turning a risk response into concrete actions that can be owned and tracked, because vague actions are where accountability goes to die. If the response is mitigation, the actions should specify what control change will happen, what evidence will demonstrate it, and what timeline is expected. If the response is acceptance, the actions should specify who will accept, what rationale will be documented, what monitoring will occur, and when acceptance will be reviewed. If the response is avoidance, actions should specify what will be discontinued or changed, what alternative will be used, and how removal of exposure will be verified. If the response involves sharing or transfer, actions should specify what contractual or assurance steps are needed and who will manage them. Collaboration helps refine these actions so they are realistic and aligned with operations. Accountability requires that the final actions are unambiguous and linked to owners who have the authority and capability to deliver. When actions are concrete, meetings become productive, because people can discuss trade-offs and sequencing instead of arguing about what they are even supposed to do. Collaboration also requires careful handling of ownership boundaries, especially in environments with shared services and cross-team dependencies. A system team may not control identity services, network infrastructure, or centralized logging platforms, yet their system's compliance depends on those services operating properly. If you assign an action to the system team that depends on another team, you risk setting them up for failure. On the other hand, if you diffuse responsibility across multiple teams without a clear coordinator, the action may never complete. A strong approach is to assign a primary owner who is responsible for the outcome and who coordinates dependencies, while also assigning supporting owners for specific deliverables. The primary owner does not necessarily do all the work, but they own making sure the work gets done. This mirrors how projects succeed in real life: one accountable person and multiple contributors. Collaboration thrives when contributors know what they are responsible for and when the primary owner removes blockers. Accountability stays intact because there is a clear answer to who owns the outcome. A common collaboration failure is the blame spiral, where stakeholders focus on who caused the risk rather than how to reduce it. Blame spirals waste time and make people hide problems, which undermines governance. A better approach is to keep discussions anchored in requirements, evidence, and risk, and to frame actions as improvements rather than punishments. This does not mean ignoring negligence if it exists, but most control weaknesses are the result of unclear processes, competing priorities, or missing resources rather than malicious intent. When you keep language neutral and focus on facts, stakeholders are more willing to cooperate and provide accurate information. Collaboration improves when people feel safe telling the truth about constraints, like staffing shortages or tooling limitations. Accountability does not require blame. It requires clarity and follow-through. In fact, reducing blame often strengthens accountability because people stop wasting energy defending themselves and start investing energy in solving the problem. Meetings and communication are another place where collaboration can either strengthen or weaken accountability. Regular check-ins can be helpful, but too many meetings with no decisions create fatigue and avoidance. The collaboration goal should be to use communication to remove ambiguity, resolve blockers, and confirm progress toward evidence-based completion. A useful practice is to ensure each discussion ends with clear next steps, owners, and dates, even when the next step is to gather more information. Accountability also depends on maintaining a single source of truth for action status, because if different stakeholders track progress in different places, confusion and disputes follow. Communication should also include escalation rules, such as what happens if a milestone is missed or if a dependency team cannot deliver. Escalation is not about punishment. It is about ensuring that risk decisions receive the attention and resources they require. When escalation is defined in advance, stakeholders are less likely to interpret it as personal conflict. Collaboration becomes smoother because everyone knows the process, and accountability stays visible. Another key concept is preserving decision integrity, meaning that collaboration should refine how actions are executed, but should not quietly change what was decided without proper authority. For example, if leadership accepted a risk under certain conditions, collaboration should focus on documenting acceptance, monitoring, and review dates, not on slowly turning acceptance into indefinite inaction. If leadership chose mitigation, collaboration should not turn it into acceptance because the fix is hard, unless the decision authority revisits the response and formally changes it. This is where governance professionals often act as stewards, ensuring that the organization's risk decisions are executed as intended. It is also where assessors and risk managers need to be careful not to become the owners of remediation, because that can compromise independence. Collaboration does not mean you take over the work. It means you support stakeholders in understanding what must happen and what evidence will prove it happened. Accountability remains with the designated owners, while governance ensures tracking and verification. This separation keeps the assessment and risk processes credible. Collaboration also benefits from thoughtful prioritization, because stakeholders often face many competing demands. Even when everyone agrees that a risk should be mitigated, the question becomes when and in what order. Prioritization should be grounded in risk, requirements, and dependencies, not in who shouts the loudest. Some actions may be urgent because they address high likelihood and high impact, while others may be strategically important because they fix systemic root causes. Dependencies matter too, because some actions cannot start until foundational work is completed, like establishing an inventory or clarifying ownership. Collaboration helps map these realities and build a sequence that is feasible. Accountability requires that the sequence is agreed to and tracked, and that deferrals are documented rather than silently ignored. Deferrals are sometimes appropriate, but they should be explicit with an understanding of what risk remains during the delay. When prioritization is handled transparently, stakeholders are more likely to commit resources, and governance can report progress honestly. It is also important to integrate evidence expectations into collaboration, because the goal is not just to perform actions, but to prove they were effective. Many remediation efforts fail the next assessment not because nothing was done, but because evidence was not created or preserved. Collaboration should include agreement on what completion looks like, including what artifacts will be generated and where they will be stored. For example, if the action is to implement periodic access reviews, completion is not just setting a reminder. Completion includes review records for a defined period that show the process occurred and exceptions were handled. If the action is to improve change control, completion includes consistent approval records and evidence of enforcement. Evidence expectations should be aligned with the assessment criteria so that when reassessment happens, the organization can demonstrate improvement without scrambling. Accountability strengthens when evidence is part of the definition of done because it turns progress from a claim into a fact. This also reduces arguments later because everyone agreed up front what proof would be required. By the end of this topic, you should understand that collaborating on risk response actions is a governance skill that blends communication, project discipline, and clear responsibility boundaries. Collaboration is necessary because risk work crosses teams and affects business operations. But accountability must remain clear so that actions actually complete and residual risk is managed intentionally. The practical keys are to translate responses into concrete actions with owners and timelines, manage dependencies with a primary accountable owner, keep discussions anchored in requirements and evidence, and use communication to remove blockers rather than to spin in circles. Decision integrity matters, meaning collaboration refines execution but does not quietly rewrite risk decisions without proper authority. Finally, completion must include evidence, because the organization needs to prove improvements, not just believe in them. When you collaborate this way, risk response becomes a coordinated effort that drives real control improvement, and governance becomes something people respect because it produces results instead of confusion.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.